Today, we're uncovering 25 fruits that big agriculture tried to erase from history. Some were so hardy they survived ice ages, others so nutritious they sustained entire civilizations through famines. They might not look perfect on supermarket shelves, but in a world of flavorless, chemical-dependent crops, these forgotten fruits might just be the most powerful weapons in your garden arsenal. Number 25. American persimmons. Stand in an abandoned farmstead in rural Kentucky, and you might still find them. Gnarled trees heavy with orange globes that glow like lanterns in the autumn sun. The American persimmon. These weren't planted for beauty. They were planted for survival. Native American tribes called persimmons food of the gods, and for good reason. A single tree can produce over 200 pounds of fruit, each persimmon packed with more vitamin C than an orange and enough natural sugars to sustain a family through winter. When other crops failed, when corn withered and apples rotted, the persimmon endured. Early settlers learned to dry persimmons into leather-like sheets that could last for years. They ground the seeds into coffee substitutes during wartime shortages. They even made beer from the fermented fruit. This wasn't just a tree, it was a complete survival system that asked for nothing and gave everything. But here's the tragedy. American persimmons take 7 to 10 years to bear fruit, and the trees are either male or female, meaning you need multiple trees for production. In an agricultural system obsessed with quick profits and guaranteed yields, patience became a luxury no one could afford. Number 24. Paws. Hidden in the forests of 26 states grows a fruit so extraordinary that Thomas Jefferson grew it at Monticello, and Lewis and Clark wrote about encountering it during their expedition. The pawpaw tastes like a cross between banana, mango, and vanilla custard. Growing wild in Ohio, pawpaws are the largest native fruit in North America and the only temperate member of a tropical fruit family. The trees are naturally pest-resistant, require no fertilizers, and actually prefer partial shade, making them perfect for forest gardens where other fruits won't grow. But pawpaws had one fatal flaw for commercial agriculture. They're extremely perishable. Once ripe, they last only 2 to 3 days before spoiling. You can't ship them across the country or store them for weeks. You have to eat them when nature says they're ready, not when the supply chain demands it. This made them impossible to commercialize using traditional distribution methods. While they were perfect for local consumption, they couldn't survive the journey to distant markets that modern agriculture requires. So, America largely abandoned a fruit that grows naturally across much of the eastern United States, requires no care once established, and offers a unique tropical flavor experience. Today, pawpaw trees are gaining popularity among gardeners who appreciate their ecological benefits and extraordinary taste. Number 23. The elderberry giant. Picture this, clusters of deep purple berries so dark they look almost black, hanging from trees that our Viking ancestors considered sacred. The elderberry wasn't just food, it was medicine, magic, and survival rolled into nature's perfect package. In medieval Europe, every village had its elder tree, and every grandmother knew its secrets. The berries could be dried and stored for years, providing vitamin C through scurvy-plagued winters. The flowers made healing teas. Even the bark had medicinal properties. This wasn't just a fruit tree. It was a pharmacy that grew in your backyard. Here's what big agriculture doesn't want you to know. A single elderberry bush can produce up to 40 pounds of berries annually, with antioxidant levels that make blueberries look like candy. But elderberries don't ship well, don't store long, and can't be mechanically harvested. So they disappeared from commercial production, taking centuries of healing wisdom with them. Number 22. Beach plums. Along the Atlantic coast, from Maine to Virginia, beach plums once provided coastal communities with a reliable source of fruit that thrived in sandy soil and salt spray. These small, intensely flavored plums were perfectly adapted to harsh coastal conditions and required no care once established. Beach plums were remarkable for their ability to survive in conditions that would kill most fruit trees. They could withstand salt spray, sandy soil, and the harsh winds that characterize coastal environments. The plants also helped stabilize dunes and prevent erosion, a natural benefit that made them valuable beyond their fruit. The plums made exceptional jams and jellies with a unique tart-sweet flavor that captured the essence of the seaside. Coastal families would gather them during the brief harvest season, preserving them to enjoy throughout the year. As coastal development accelerated in the mid-20th century, much of the natural beach plum habitat was lost to housing developments and commercial construction. While the plants weren't deliberately eliminated, their specialized habitat became increasingly rare, and with it, the knowledge of how to harvest and use them. Number 21. Wild grapes. Before California became America's wine country, wild grapes grew along fence rows and woodland edges throughout the eastern United States. These native grapes were incredibly diverse, with dozens of species adapted to different climates and growing conditions. Wild grapes were the foundation of America's earliest winemaking efforts. The flavors were bold and distinctive, reflecting the local soil and climate in ways that standardized commercial varieties cannot. Some wild grapes could survive harsh winters that would kill European varieties, while others thrived in hot, humid conditions. The shift toward commercial wine production favored European grape varieties that produced wines with familiar flavors and characteristics. While wild American grapes had natural disease resistance and local adaptation, they produced wines that tasted different from European standards. And different was not what the emerging commercial market wanted. Today, some winemakers are rediscovering Native American grapes and creating wines that celebrate these unique flavors. Number 20. Service berries, June berries. In early summer, when strawberries were finished and other fruits weren't yet ripe, service berries provided a crucial bridge in the seasonal fruit calendar. These small, sweet berries grew on attractive shrubs that served dual purposes as both ornamental plants and food sources. Service berries were incredibly reliable and required virtually no care once established. The shrubs could survive harsh winters, drought conditions, and poor soil while still producing abundant crops of nutritious berries. They were perfectly adapted to North American growing conditions. The berries were traditionally dried for winter storage, made into pemmican for travel food, and eaten fresh during their brief harvest season. Native Americans and early settlers planned their seasonal activities around service berry harvests in many regions. Number 19. American chestnuts. Before a devastating blight wiped out an estimated 4 billion trees, American chestnuts were a cornerstone of rural economies and dinner tables across the eastern United States. These massive trees produced sweet, nutritious nuts that were roasted on street corners, ground into flour, and stored for winter food. American chestnut forests once covered millions of acres. The nuts were an important food source for both wildlife and human communities, and the trees provided valuable timber as well. The harvest season was a community event, with families gathering nuts that would sustain them through the winter months. The blight that destroyed American chestnuts was introduced through imported Asian chestnuts in the early 1900s. Within decades, one of America's most important native food sources was virtually extinct. This wasn't a commercial decision. It was an ecological disaster that eliminated an entire species from most of its native range. Today, scientists and conservationists are working to restore American chestnuts through breeding programs that combine the disease resistance of Asian varieties with the characteristics of the original American trees. Number 18. Mulberries. In the early 1900s, mulberry trees were common in American backyards, producing abundant crops of sweet berries that children would climb trees to harvest. These fast-growing trees were valued for their shade, their fruit, and their ability to attract beneficial wildlife. Mulberries were incredibly productive and required no care once established. The trees could produce fruit for decades, providing fresh berries throughout much of the summer. Different varieties ripened at different times, extending the harvest season for families who planted multiple trees. The downfall of mulberries in suburban areas was their messiness. The ripe berries would drop naturally, staining sidewalks, driveways, and cars. As American neighborhoods became more focused on tidy, controlled landscapes, mulberry trees were seen as nuisances rather than food sources. Number 17. Wild strawberries. Before strawberries became the large, uniform fruits we see in grocery stores, wild strawberries grew in meadows and woodland edges throughout North America. These tiny berries were intensely flavored with a sweetness and complexity that modern commercial strawberries rarely match. Wild strawberries were the original genetic foundation for all cultivated varieties. They were smaller but more flavorful and perfectly adapted to local growing conditions. The plants spread naturally through runners, creating patches that could provide fruit for entire communities. Commercial strawberry production focused on traits that mattered for mass marketing: size, appearance, shipping durability, and uniform ripening. Wild strawberries were too small, too delicate, and too variable in ripening time for efficient commercial production and distribution. Number 16. American hazelnuts. In the forests and prairies of the eastern United States, American hazelnuts once provided a reliable source of protein and healthy fats for both wildlife and human communities. These native nuts were smaller than European hazelnuts, but were perfectly adapted to local growing conditions. American hazelnuts required no irrigation, fertilizers, or pest control to thrive. The bushes formed natural windbreaks and wildlife habitat, while producing nutritious nuts that could be stored for months. They were incredibly hardy, surviving harsh winters and drought conditions that would stress other nut crops. The commercial nut industry focused on larger European hazelnuts that could be mechanically harvested and processed more efficiently. Number 15. Wild plums. Across the American prairie and woodland edges, wild plums once provided early settlers and Native Americans with a reliable source of fresh fruit and preserved food. These small tart plums were incredibly diverse, with different species adapted to various climates and soil conditions. Wild plums were remarkably hardy, surviving droughts, floods, and temperature extremes that would kill cultivated varieties. They made excellent preserves and dried fruit, with complex flavors that were more interesting than many modern commercial plums. As agriculture became more mechanized and commercialized, wild plums were often seen as weeds rather than food sources. They were removed from fence rows and woodland edges to make room for crops or to create cleaner property lines, eliminating habitat for these valuable native fruits. Number 14. Gooseberries. Gooseberries were once a staple in American gardens, prized for their tart flavor and high vitamin C content. These berries made exceptional pies, jams, and sauces, with flavors ranging from sweet to intensely sour depending on the variety. The federal ban on gooseberries and currants was implemented as a public health measure to prevent white pine blister rust, a disease that threatened the timber industry. While the ban was based on legitimate concerns about forest health, it effectively eliminated these fruits from American gardens for decades. Gooseberries were particularly valued for their high pectin content, which made them excellent for jam making without added thickeners. Number 13. Black currants. Black currants faced an even more complete prohibition than gooseberries because they were considered the primary host for white pine blister rust. These intensely flavored berries were prized in European cuisine and had been successfully grown in America by immigrant communities. The ban on black currants was so thorough and long-lasting that most Americans today have never tasted these berries, despite their continued popularity in Europe. The prohibition lasted for decades in most states, effectively erasing black currants from American agricultural knowledge. Black currants were valued for their unique, intense flavor and their use in traditional preserves, wines, and medicinal preparations. Number 12. Crab apples. Every old farmstead seemed to have at least one crab apple tree, valued not for fresh eating, but for making exceptional jellies and preserves. These small, tart apples were packed with natural pectin and had complex flavors that added depth to traditional recipes. Crab apples were incredibly hardy and productive, often bearing fruit when full-size apple trees failed due to late frosts or poor weather conditions. They served as reliable backup crops and were essential ingredients in many traditional preserving recipes. Modern apple production focused on large, sweet apples for fresh consumption, gradually relegating crab apples to purely ornamental status. Number 11. Huckleberries. In the mountains and forests of the Pacific Northwest and northern states, huckleberries provided Native Americans and early settlers with intensely flavored wild fruit. These berries had complex wine-like flavors that were far more intense than cultivated blueberries. Huckleberries grew in harsh mountain conditions that concentrated their flavors and nutrients. The annual harvest was often a community event, with families traveling to traditional picking grounds that had been used for generations. Commercial blueberry production gradually replaced huckleberries in the American diet. Blueberries were easier to cultivate, larger, and more uniform, making them better suited to commercial agriculture and mass distribution. However, they lacked the intense, complex flavors of wild huckleberries. Number 10. Mayhaws. In the swamps and wetlands of the southeastern United States, mayhaw trees provided communities with a unique fruit that ripened in May, when few other fresh fruits were available. These small, tart fruits made exceptional jellies that were considered delicacies throughout the South. Mayhaws were perfectly adapted to wetland conditions, thriving in areas that would be unsuitable for most other fruit trees. They could survive periodic flooding and actually produced better crops in wet years, making them valuable for difficult growing sites. As wetlands were drained for development and agriculture throughout the 20th century, much of the natural mayhaw habitat disappeared. The trees weren't deliberately eliminated, but their specialized growing conditions became increasingly rare. Number 9. Sand cherries. Across the Great Plains and northern prairies, sand cherries provided early settlers with reliable fruit in harsh climates where other fruits couldn't survive. These small, tart cherries were perfectly adapted to sandy soils, extreme temperatures, and drought conditions. Sand cherries were incredibly hardy, surviving prairie fires, blizzards, and droughts that would destroy other fruit plants. They were often the only fresh fruit available to prairie communities during the growing season, making them valuable despite their small size and tart flavor. As the Great Plains were converted to large-scale agriculture, sand cherry habitat was often eliminated to make room for crops. Number 8. Wild cranberries. Before cranberries became a commercial crop grown in constructed bogs, wild cranberries grew in natural wetlands throughout northern North America. These small, intensely tart berries were gathered by Native Americans and early settlers for both food and medicine. Wild cranberries were perfectly adapted to harsh northern climates and acidic wetland conditions. They required no care once established and could produce fruit in areas where few other crops would survive. The berries could be stored fresh for months without spoiling. Commercial cranberry production focused on larger, more uniform berries that could be mechanically harvested from flooded bogs. This system was much more efficient than gathering wild cranberries from scattered natural wetlands, but it also meant abandoning the genetic diversity of wild populations. Number 7. Buffalo berries. On the Great Plains, buffalo berries provided Native Americans and early settlers with vitamin-rich fruit that could survive the harshest prairie conditions. These small, tart berries grew on thorny shrubs that thrived where other fruits failed completely. Buffalo berries were incredibly hardy, surviving prairie fires, extreme cold, and prolonged droughts. The shrubs formed dense thickets that provided shelter for wildlife and helped prevent soil erosion, making them valuable for both food and conservation purposes. As the Great Plains were converted to agriculture, buffalo berry habitat was systematically removed. The thorny shrubs were seen as obstacles to farming and ranching operations, and they were cleared to make room for crops and pastures. Number 6. Rose hips. Every old garden had roses, and experienced gardeners knew that the bright red fruits that followed the flowers were valuable for both food and medicine. Rose hips from wild and heritage roses were particularly rich in vitamin C and other nutrients. Rose hips were traditionally used to make jellies, teas, and syrups that provided important nutrition, especially during winter months when fresh fruit was scarce. During World War II, rose hip collection was actually promoted as a way to supplement vitamin C intake when citrus fruits were rationed. Modern rose breeding focused primarily on flower characteristics rather than fruit production. Many modern rose varieties produce few or no rose hips, eliminating this traditional food source from most gardens. Number 5. Autumn olives. Originally planted for erosion control and wildlife habitat, autumn olives produced small, speckled berries that were both edible and nutritious. These shrubs were incredibly hardy and productive, thriving in poor soils where other plants struggled. Autumn olives were so successful at establishing themselves that they eventually became problematic in many areas, spreading beyond their intended plantings and competing with native vegetation. This led to their classification as invasive species in many states. The irony is that autumn olives produce abundant, nutritious fruit that could be valuable if properly managed. However, their aggressive spreading habit made them unwelcome in most landscapes, leading to active removal efforts rather than harvest programs. Number 4. Chokeberries. Native to North America, chokeberries were used by Native Americans and early settlers for both food and medicine. These small, dark berries were astringent when raw but made excellent jellies, wines, and dried fruit when properly processed. Chokeberries were perfectly adapted to harsh climates and poor soils, thriving in conditions where other fruits failed. They required no care once established and could produce fruit reliably for decades, making them valuable for subsistence agriculture. Modern fruit production focused on berries that were pleasant to eat fresh, leaving chokeberries behind, despite their hardiness and nutritional content. The astringent flavor that made them unsuitable for fresh eating also made them less appealing to commercial markets. Number 3. Wild apples. Before commercial apple production standardized around a few varieties, wild apples grew throughout North America with incredible diversity in size, color, flavor, and growing characteristics. These apples were perfectly adapted to local conditions and required no care once established. Wild apples represented centuries of natural selection and adaptation to specific climates and soils. Some were sweet, others tart. Some were good for fresh eating, others better for cider or cooking. This diversity provided resilience and options that modern apple production lacks. Commercial apple production focused on varieties that could be grown efficiently, harvested mechanically, stored for long periods, and shipped long distances. Number 2. Wild cherries. Throughout the forests of North America, wild cherries provided abundant fruit for both wildlife and human communities. These small, dark cherries were intensely flavored and made excellent preserves, wines, and dried fruit for those who knew how to use them. Wild cherries were incredibly hardy, surviving in the forest conditions where cultivated cherries would fail. The trees also provided valuable timber, making them doubly useful to early American communities that needed both food and building materials. As forests were cleared for agriculture and development, wild cherry habitat largely disappeared. The trees were often valued more for their timber than their fruit, and the knowledge of how to harvest and use wild cherries was lost along with the trees themselves. Number 1. American grapes. Before European grape varieties dominated American wine production, Native American grapes grew wild throughout much of the continent. These grapes were incredibly diverse, with dozens of species adapted to different climates and growing conditions. American grapes were the foundation of the country's earliest wine-making efforts, producing wines with distinctive flavors that reflected their American origins. The grapes were also excellent for fresh eating, jellies, and juices with bold, complex flavors. The shift toward European grape varieties in commercial wine production was driven by consumer preferences for wines that matched European styles. While American grapes had natural disease resistance and local adaptation, they produced wines that tasted different from established European standards. These 25 forgotten fruits tell the story of how American agriculture changed over the past century. From native persimmons with 9 times more vitamin C than their Asian cousins, to wild grapes that made distinctly American wines, each represents genetic diversity and local adaptation that took centuries to develop. Many are making a comeback thanks to gardeners and researchers who recognize their value. Subscribe to discover more forgotten treasures from America's agricultural past, and check out the next video on your screen about the heirloom vegetables your great-grandparents grew that you need to plant today.